Venezuela forces a global the hidden battle for the 21st century's first multipolar crisis. Let me take you back to January 23, 2024, not the date of some grand summit or a high-profile assassination, but the day Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro announced a referendum claiming sovereignty over the Essequibo, a 61,600 square mile oil-rich region controlled by Guyana. At first glance, it seemed like just another Latin American territorial dispute, the kind of thing that makes a brief appearance in the news cycle before fading into obscurity. But here's what the headlines didn't tell: this wasn't just about a border. This was the opening salvo in a geopolitical earthquake, one that could redraw the map of global power in ways we haven't seen since the fall of the Soviet Union. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of resource politics, great power competition, and the slow-motion collapse of American unipolarity. And let me tell you, what's unfolding in Venezuela right now isn't just a crisis, it's a test. A test of whether the United States can still enforce its will on the world stage, whether China and Russia can carve out new spheres of influence without direct confrontation, and whether the global South will finally break free from the post-Cold War order. The mainstream media has framed this as a simple case of Venezuelan aggression, a rogue state bullying a smaller neighbor. But that narrative is dangerously incomplete. The truth is far more complex, and far more consequential. So let's start with the official story, what they want you to believe. The official: a rogue state and a helpless victim. On December 3, 2023, Venezuela held a national referendum where, according to the government, over 95% of voters approved the annexation of Essequibo. The international community reacted with predictable outrage. The U.S. State Department called it a transparent attempt to distract from Maduro's domestic failures. The UK, Guyana's former colonial ruler, dispatched a warship to the region as a show of support. The UN Security Council held emergency sessions. The media narrative was Venezuela, a failed petrostate under crippling sanctions, was lashing out at a smaller, democratic neighbor to rally nationalist support and deflect from its own economic collapse. The numbers seem to back this up. Venezuela's GDP has shrunk by over 75% since 2013. Hyperinflation has rendered the bolivar worthless. Millions have fled the country. Maduro's approval ratings hover around 20%. So when he suddenly pivoted to a nationalist cause, claiming a territory that makes up 2/3 of Guyana's landmass, it looked like classic authoritarian scapegoating. The US and its allies framed it as a desperate dictator trying to cling to power by manufacturing an external enemy. And then there's Guyana. A tiny country of 800,000 people, but one sitting on what the New York Times called the world's hottest oil play. ExxonMobil, Hess, and CNOOC have discovered over 11 billion barrels of recoverable oil off Guyana's coast, enough to make it one of the top 20 oil producers in the world. Venezuela's claim to Essequibo isn't just about land, it's about control over those reserves. The US has a vested interest in protecting Guyana's sovereignty, not just out of principle, but because American energy commies have billions invested there. The Biden administration has been any Venezuelan aggression will be met with all necessary measures. That's the story you've been told. A clear-cut case of a bully picking on a weaker neighbor, with the US and its allies standing up for the little guy. But here's the problem with this: it ignores the deeper geopolitical currents at play. It assumes this is just about Venezuela, when in reality, it's about something much bigger: the unraveling of the American-led world order and the rise of a new multipolar system. Deconstructing what's really happening in Venezuela. Let's start with the referendum itself. The Venezuelan government claims 95% approval for annexing Essequibo. But independent observers, including the Carter Center, have raised serious doubts about the legitimacy of the vote. The opposition boycotted it. Turnout was suspiciously low in urban areas. And most damningly, the question on the ballot was worded in a way that made rejection nearly: do you agree to reject the Paris Arbitral Award of 1899, which fraudulently sought to deprive us of our Essequibo territory? That's not a referendum, it's a propaganda exercise. But here's where it gets interesting. The US and its allies have been quick to condemn Maduro's actions, yet they've been far less vocal about the real driver of this: the scramble for Guyana's oil. ExxonMobil's discovery in 2015 turned Guyana into the most lucrative energy frontier in the world. By 2027, Guyana is projected to be producing over 1.2 million barrels of oil per day, more than OPEC members like Algeria or Angola. And who stands to benefit? Not just Exxon, but also China, which has been quietly investing in Guyana's infrastructure, and Russia, which has been supplying Venezuela with arms and political support. Now, let's talk about the sanctions. The US has maintained a brutal sanctions regime against Venezuela since 2019, cutting it off from global financial markets and crippling its oil exports. The stated goal? To force Maduro from power. But here's the sanctions don't work the way policymakers think they do. They don't topple regimes, they entrench them. Look at Cuba, Iran, North Korea. Sanctions create a siege mentality, rallying the population around the government. And in Venezuela's case, they've had an unintended pushing Maduro into the arms of America's rivals. Since 2020, Venezuela has been selling oil to China at a steep discount, using Russian and Iranian intermediaries to bypass US restrictions. In return, China has provided loans, investment, and diplomatic cover. Russia has supplied advanced air defense systems and military advisors. Iran has sent technicians to help restart Venezuela's refineries. This isn't just about survival, it's about building an alternative economic bloc, one that operates outside the dollar-dominated financial system. And that brings us to the Essequibo crisis. Maduro isn't just acting out of desperation. He's making it calculated that the US is too distracted by Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East to risk a direct confrontation in Latin America. That China and Russia will back him diplomatically. And that Guyana, despite its oil wealth, is too weak to defend itself without American intervention. But here's the Maduro might be right. The X did geopolitical a new Cold War in the Western Hemisphere. To understand why this crisis matters, you have to out. We're not just talking about Venezuela and Guyana. We're talking about the first major test of whether the US can still enforce its Monroe Doctrine, the 200-year-old policy that declares Latin America as America's exclusive sphere of influence. For decades, the US treated Latin America as its backyard. Coups in Chile, Guatemala, Brazil. Proxy wars in Nicaragua, El Salvador. Economic domination through the IMF and World Bank. But the world has changed. China is now the largest trading partner for most of Latin America. Russia has reasserted itself as a military and diplomatic player. And the global South is no longer willing to accept American hegemony without a fight. This is where the Essequibo crisis becomes a proxy for something much: the battle between unipolarity and multipolarity. The US still operates under the assumption that it can dictate the rules of the game. But China and Russia are playing a different game entirely, one where economic influence, not military power, is the primary tool of statecraft. Let me give you an example. In 2022, Argentina's then president, Alberto Fernandez, traveled to Beijing and signed a deal to join China's Belt and Road Initiative. The US responded with quiet alarm, but there was little it could do. Argentina needed the investment. China was happy to provide it. The same dynamic is playing out across the region. Brazil, under Lula, has balanced between the US and China. Mexico has become a manufacturing hub for Chinese commies looking to bypass US tariffs. Even Colombia, America's closest ally in the region, has deepened ties with Beijing. Now, Venezuela is the first country to openly challenge US dominance in a way that forces Washington to respond. And the response has been telling. The US has deployed warships to the region. It has conducted joint military exercises with Guyana. It has warned Maduro of severe consequences if he invades. But here's the US is stretched thin. It's fighting a proxy war in Ukraine. It's preparing for a potential conflict over Taiwan. It's managing crises in the Middle East. And now it's being forced to divert attention to a territorial dispute in South America. This is the paradox of American power in the 21st century. The US is still the world's dominant military and economic force, but its ability to project power is diminishing. Every time it intervenes in one crisis, it creates vulnerabilities elsewhere. And its adversaries know this. That's why China and Russia have been so aggressive in extending their influence, not through direct confrontation, but through economic leverage, diplomatic maneuvering, and strategic patience. Now, let's talk about the historical parallels. This isn't the first time a great power has faced a challenge to its regional dominance. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis forced the US to confront the reality of Soviet power in its own hemisphere. The result? A tense standoff that nearly led to nuclear war, but ultimately reinforced the idea that the Western Hemisphere was off-limits to America's rivals. But today, the dynamics are different. The Soviet Union was a military superpower, but an economic weakling. China is both. It doesn't need to deploy missiles to Venezuela to challenge US influence, it just needs to offer an alternative. And that's exactly what it's doing. Military and strategic, the illusion of quick and easy solutions. Let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where things get dangerous. The US has made it clear that it will defend Guyana's territorial integrity. But what does that actually mean? Right now, the US has a small military presence in Guyana, mostly advisors and special forces. The UK has sent a warship, the HMS Trent, to conduct routine patrols. The US Southern Command has increased surveillance flights over the region. But none of this is a deterrent. Venezuela's military, despite its economic struggles, is still one of the most capable in Latin America. It has Russian-made S-300 air defense systems, Sukhoi fighter jets, and a well-trained army. And crucially, it has the home field advantage. Now, some hawks in Washington are calling for a more aggressive response. They point to the success of the 2003 Iraq invasion or the 2011 Libya intervention as proof that the US can quickly and decisively remove a hostile regime. But let me tell you, those were exceptions, not the rule. Iraq descended into chaos. Libya became a failed state. And Venezuela? It's not Iraq or Libya. It's a country with a population of 28 million, a well-armed military, and the backing of two nuclear powers. Here's what a US intervention in Venezuela would look: a prolonged air campaign to degrade Venezuela's air defenses, followed by a ground invasion. The US would likely face stiff resistance, not just from the Venezuelan military, but from pro-government militias. And then there's the question of what comes in. Do we install a puppet government? Do we partition the country? Do we occupy it indefinitely? Because that's what it would take to stabilize Venezuela after an invasion. And let's not forget the regional fallout. Brazil, under Lula, has already warned against any military action. Mexico has called for dialogue. Even Colombia, America's closest ally in the region, has urged caution. The last thing Latin America wants is another US invasion. But here's the real: even if the US did intervene, it wouldn't solve the underlying problem. Because the problem isn't just Maduro. It's the fact that Venezuela has become a battleground for great power competition. And in that competition, the US is losing. The domestic political why this crisis is about more than foreign policy. Now, let's talk about the domestic politics of this crisis, because this is where things get really interesting. The Biden administration's response to Venezuela isn't just about geopolitics, it's about domestic politics. And that's a problem, because domestic politics and foreign policy don't always mix well. Let's start with Florida. Florida is a swing state, and it's home to a large Venezuelan exile community, many of whom fled Maduro's regime. These voters are a key part of the Republican base, and they've been pushing for a tougher stance on Venezuela. The Biden administration knows this. That's why, in 2022, it temporarily eased sanctions on Venezuela in exchange for Maduro's promise to hold free elections. But when Maduro reneged on that promise, the administration was forced to reverse course. Now, with the Essequibo crisis heating up, the administration is under pressure to take a hard line. But here's the: a hard line could backfire. If the US escalates militarily, it risks alienating the rest of Latin America. If it doesn't, it risks looking weak to voters in Florida. And if it tries to thread the needle, say, by imposing new sanctions, it risks pushing Maduro even closer to China and Russia. This is the dilemma of American foreign policy in the 21st century. Domestic political incentives often push policymakers toward short-term, symbolic actions that do little to advance long-term strategic goals. And in the case of Venezuela, those incentives are pulling the administration in opposite directions. But this isn't just about Florida. It's about the broader crisis of American democracy. The U.S. is deeply polarized. Its institutions are under strain. And its foreign policy is increasingly driven by domestic political considerations rather than strategic logic. That's a dangerous combination, because it means the U.S. is more likely to make impulsive, reactive decisions that could escalate conflicts rather than resolve them. Scenario how this crisis could unfold. So where does this go from here? Let me lay out 3 possible scenarios, along with their probabilities. This is the most likely scenario. Venezuela doesn't invade Guyana outright, but it engages in a series of provocations, military exercises near the border, cyber attacks on Guyanese infrastructure, economic pressure on foreign commies operating in Essequibo. The U.S. responds with targeted sanctions, increased military aid to Guyana, and a show of force in the region. China and Russia provide diplomatic cover for Venezuela, but they stop short of direct military support. This scenario is dangerous because it creates a prolonged standoff, one where miscalculation could lead to a direct conflict. But it's also the scenario where the U.S. has the most leverage. It can use economic pressure to force Maduro to the negotiating table, while avoiding the risks of a full-scale war. Scenario 3: Direct conflict. In this scenario, Venezuela launches a limited military incursion into Essequibo, seizing a small but strategically important area. The U.S. responds with airstrikes on Venezuelan military targets, and the conflict escalates. China and Russia provide military aid to Venezuela, turning the crisis into a proxy war. The result? A prolonged, bloody conflict with no clear winner. This is the worst-case scenario, but it's not impossible. Maduro is desperate, and desperate leaders make reckless decisions. The U.S. is overstretched, and overstretched powers are more likely to overreact. And China and Russia? They have every incentive to turn Venezuela into a quagmire for the U.S. Now, let me be none of these scenarios are good. Even the best-case scenario leaves Venezuela under Maduro's rule, with all the human rights abuses and economic mismanagement that entails. The most likely scenario creates a prolonged crisis that distracts from other global challenges. And the worst-case scenario? It could plunge the region into war. Grand strategy: the unsustainable cost of American hegemony. This brings me to the bigger picture. The Venezuela crisis isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the unsustainable cost of American hegemony. For the last 30 years, the U.S. has operated under the assumption that it can and should be the world's policeman. That it can impose its will on other countries, whether through military force, economic sanctions, or diplomatic pressure. But that assumption is being tested like never before. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost trillions of dollars and thousands of lives, with little to show for it. The sanctions on Iran, Russia, and Venezuela have hurt those countries, but they've also accelerated the decline of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. And the diplomatic pressure on China? It's pushed Beijing to build alternative institutions, from the BRICS Bank to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The reality is the U.S. is trying to maintain a unipolar world in a multipolar era. And it's failing. The rest of the world is moving on. China is building a parallel economic order. Russia is reasserting itself as a military power. And the global South is no longer willing to accept American dominance without a fight. This isn't just a problem for Venezuela. It's a problem for the entire architecture of American power. And Venezuela is just the latest stress test, a pressure point where the contradictions of U.S. strategy are laid bare. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about oil or democracy or even Maduro himself. It's about the slow-motion collapse of the post-Cold War order, and the U.S. is still trying to fight the last war. The 1990s playbook, sanctions, regime change rhetoric, and the occasional cruise missile no longer works when your adversaries have spent the last 2 decades building resilience against it. Take Russia's response to Western sanctions after 2014. The U.S. expected economic isolation to cripple Moscow, Instead, Russia pivoted to self-sufficiency, deepened ties with China, and weaponized its own energy exports. By 2022, when the West imposed even harsher measures over Ukraine, Russia's economy didn't collapse, it adapted. The ruble stabilized, trade with India and China surged, and Europe, not Russia, ended up in an energy crisis. That's the new reality. Sanctions don't just fail, they often backfire, accelerating the very multipolarity the US is trying to prevent. Let me explain why this matters for Venezuela. The US has sanctioned Venezuela's oil sector since 2019, cutting off its primary revenue stream. The goal was to starve Maduro of funds and force his ouster. But here's the uncomfortable: it didn't work. Venezuela's oil production did collapse, from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to just 700,000 in 2020, but Maduro didn't fall. Instead, he turned to China and Russia for lifelines. Beijing extended billions in loans, secured by future oil deliveries. Moscow sent military advisors, Wagner Group mercenaries, and even deployed nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in 2018 as a show of force. The sanctions didn't isolate Venezuela, they pushed it deeper into the arms of America's rivals. And now, with the US distracted by Ukraine and Taiwan, those rivals are doubling down. Here's where the military implications get serious. Venezuela isn't just a failed state, it's a forward operating base for great power competition. Russia has used it to project power into the Western Hemisphere, a direct challenge to the Monroe Doctrine. In 2022, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov warned that Moscow could deploy military assets to Venezuela and Cuba if NATO exited further east. That's not just bluster. In 2019, two Russian Tu-160 strategic bombers landed in Venezuela, accompanied by an An-124 transport plane carrying troops and equipment. The message was: if the US can station forces in Poland and the Baltics, Russia can do the same in America's backyard. China's involvement is quieter but no less strategic. Beijing has invested heavily in Venezuela's oil infrastructure, including the $14 billion Orinoco Belt project, which gives China a stake in Venezuela's long-term stability or instability, depending on how you look at it. More importantly, China has been modernizing Venezuela's military, supplying radar systems, drones, and even helping to develop a domestic arms industry. In 2021, Venezuela received a shipment of Chinese-made FN-6 portable air defense systems, a direct response to US overflights and potential airstrikes. These aren't just weapons, they're tripwires. If the US ever decides to launch a military intervention, it won't be a walkover like AMA in 1989 or Grenada in 1983. It'll be a fight against a military that's been trained, equipped, and hardened by America's two biggest adversaries. Now, the establishment narrative in Washington is that the US can still shape outcomes in Venezuela through a mix of sanctions, diplomacy, and the occasional covert operation. But that's a fantasy. The CIA's track record in Latin America isn't exactly stellar. Remember the Bay of Pigs? The Contra War? The 2002 coup attempt against Chavez, which backfired spectacularly. These weren't just failures, they were strategic blunders that strengthened the very regimes the US was trying to overthrow. Maduro isn't some fragile autocrat who will crumble under pressure. He's a survivor who has outlasted Obama, Trump, and now Biden. And he's not alone. He has the backing of Russia, China, Iran, and even Turkey, all of whom see Venezuela as a beachhead in the global contest against American hegemony. Here's the US doesn't have a good military option in Venezuela. A full-scale invasion would require hundreds of thousands of troops, a logistical nightmare given the country's size and terrain. It would also trigger a regional crisis, with Colombia, Brazil, and even Mexico forced to take sides. The political fallout would be catastrophic. Imagine the images of US soldiers fighting in the streets of Caracas, broadcast around the world. It would make Iraq look like a picnic. And for what? To install a government that would almost certainly be just as corrupt and authoritarian as Maduro's, but with the added stigma of being a US puppet? A limited strike, say, targeting Maduro's inner circle or key military installations, wouldn't work either. The Venezuelan military is deeply factionalized, and decapitating the leadership could plunge the country into chaos, creating a power vacuum that neither the US nor its allies are prepared to fill. And let's not forget the human cost. Venezuela is already a humanitarian disaster, with over 7 million refugees and a collapsing healthcare system. A military intervention would only make it worse, turning a regional crisis into a global one. So what's the alternative? The US could try to negotiate, but that would require concessions, lifting sanctions, offering amnesty to Maduro's cronies that would be politically toxic in Washington. It would also signal weakness, emboldening other adversaries. Or the US could double down on sanctions, hoping that economic pressure will eventually force Maduro out. But as we've seen with Iran and North Korea, sanctions don't topple regimes, they entrench them. They create a siege mentality, where the leadership blames all problems on external enemies and tightens its grip on power. This is the paradox of American power in the 21st century. The tools that worked in the past, military force, economic coercion, diplomatic isolation, are no longer effective, but the US hasn't developed new ones. Instead, it's stuck in a cycle of escalation, where every crisis is met with more sanctions, more rhetoric, and more military posturing, even as the returns diminish. Venezuela is just the latest example. The US has spent years trying to isolate Maduro, only to find itself isolated, with its allies in Latin America increasingly reluctant to follow its lead. Let me be, this isn't an argument for appeasement. Maduro is a brutal dictator who has destroyed his country and enriched himself while his people starve. But the question isn't whether he deserves to fall, it's whether the US has the capacity to make it happen without making things worse. And right now, the answer is no. The era of American primacy is over. The question is whether Washington can accept that reality and adapt, or whether it will keep clinging to a strategy that's doomed to fail. Venezuela is forcing that choice. And the world is watching. Now, what most people don't realize is that this paralysis in Washington isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the unraveling of the entire post-Cold War consensus on how democracies should respond to authoritarianism. The old playbook assumed that economic pressure would eventually force regimes to either reform or collapse. But Maduro has proven that assumption wrong in real time. Since 2019, when the US recognized Juan Guaidó as interim president and imposed sweeping sanctions, Venezuela's GDP has contracted by another 30%, yet the regime hasn't just survived, it's consolidated power. The opposition is fractured, the military remains loyal, and the ruling elite has adapted, shifting its economic dependencies from the US to China, Russia, and Iran. This isn't just a policy failure, it's a systemic one. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. Venezuela is the canary in the coal mine for how authoritarians now resist Western pressure. Maduro's survival strategy has three key pillars, and each one is being studied and emulated by regimes from Tehran to Minsk. First, he's weaponized migration. The exodus of 7.7 million Venezuelans, the largest displacement crisis in the Western Hemisphere's history, isn't just a humanitarian tragedy, it's a geopolitical tool. Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador have borne the brunt, straining their social services and fueling anti-immigrant backlashes that far-right politicians exploit. Maduro knows this. In 2023, when the US briefly eased sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector in exchange for electoral concessions, the regime immediately slowed the outflow of migrants only to reverse course when the deal collapsed. It was a crude but effective demonstration of how migration can be turned into leverage. Second, Maduro has mastered the art of institutional capture. The 2024 presidential election, which the opposition boycotted after its candidate was barred from running, wasn't just a sham, it was a masterclass in how to hollow out democracy while maintaining a veneer of legitimacy. The regime didn't just rig the vote, it dismantled the institutions that could have challenged it. The National Electoral Council is stacked with loyalists. The Supreme Court has disqualified over 30 opposition politicians since 2015. And the military, which controls everything from oil to food distribution, has been bought off with lucrative contracts and impunity for corruption. This isn't just repression, it's a structural redesign of the state to make it ungovernable for anyone but the ruling party. It's a model that's already being replicated in Nicaragua, where Daniel Ortega has spent the last decade purging the judiciary, banning opposition parties, and turning elections into coronations. Third, and most dangerously, Maduro has turned Venezuela into a hub for illicit finance and sanctions evasion. The country's oil exports, which once flowed to the US, now go to China, India, and even Syria, often via a shadow fleet of tankers that turn off their transponders to avoid detection. The regime has also become a key node in the global gold trade, with Venezuelan gold smuggled through Turkey and the UAE before being laundered into the international financial system. The US Treasury has sanctioned dozens of individuals and commies involved in this network, but the trade continues because the demand is insatiable. Here's the uncomfortable: sanctions don't work when the world's second largest economy, China, is willing to absorb the costs. Beijing has extended over $60 billion in loans to Venezuela since 2007, and in 2023, it imported 400,000 barrels of Venezuelan oil per day, up from just 100,000 in 2020. That's not charity, it's a strategic bet that the US can't sustain its pressure indefinitely. So where does this leave Venezuela's opposition? In a word, broken. The unity that briefly coalesced around Guaidó in 2019 has collapsed, with factions now squabbling over whether to participate in future elections or boycott them entirely. The most charismatic opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, won the primary in 2023 with 92% of the vote, only to be barred from running by the regime. Her supporters have been arrested, her rallies attacked, and her allies forced into exile. The opposition's dilemma is: if they boycott elections, they risk irrelevance; if they participate, they risk legitimizing a fraud. It's a trap that's been sprung on opposition movements from Russia to Zimbabwe, and it's devastatingly effective. But here's the: Maduro's survival isn't just about his own cunning. It's also about the West's inability to adapt. The US and its allies still operate on the assumption that authoritarian regimes are fragile, that economic pressure will eventually crack them. But what if they're not? What if, as in Venezuela, the regime can outlast the sanctions, outmaneuver the opposition, and outsource its economic survival to rival powers? That's the scenario we're now facing, and it demands a fundamental rethink of how democracies counter authoritarianism. Let me be: this isn't an argument for giving up. It's an argument for smarter strategies. The US could start by recognizing that sanctions alone won't work and that military intervention is a non-starter. Instead, it should focus on three: first, building a regional consensus to isolate Venezuela diplomatically, not just economically. That means pressuring countries like Brazil and Mexico, which have been reluctant to condemn Maduro, to take a harder line. Second, targeting the regime's financial networks more aggressively. The US has already sanctioned Venezuela's gold trade, but it needs to go further, cutting off the banks and middlemen that facilitate the trade. And third, supporting the opposition in ways that don't just make them dependent on Washington. That means funding independent media, protecting civil society, and creating pathways for exiled leaders to remain politically relevant. The hardest part, though, will be accepting that Maduro's fall isn't inevitable. The regime has survived hyperinflation, mass protests, and international isolation. It's not going anywhere soon. That doesn't mean the US should recognize Maduro or lift all sanctions, far from it. But it does mean acknowledging that the goal isn't regime change, it's containment. The US needs to shift from a strategy of collapse to one of erosion, slowly degrading the regime's capacity to project power while waiting for the next crisis to emerge. Because crises will come. They always do. History tells us that authoritarian regimes don't last forever. The Soviet Union collapsed. Apartheid ended. The Arab Spring toppled dictators. But those outcomes weren't inevitable, and they weren't the result of outside pressure alone. They happened when internal contradictions, economic mismanagement, elite fractures, popular uprisings, combined with external pressure to create a perfect storm. Venezuela is a long way from that, but the military is still loyal. The opposition is still divided. And the regime's external backers are still willing to prop it up. But the cracks are there. The question is whether the US and its allies can exploit them without making the situation worse. That's the challenge Venezuela poses to the world. It's not just about one country, it's about the future of democratic resistance in an era of rising authoritarianism. And right now, the democracies are losing. The sooner we admit that, the sooner we can start fixing it.